Hi, well, I'm Trav SD, and I'm speaking to you from Great Neck House, where we just did a wonderful event through the Great Neck Historical Society to memorialize when the Marx brothers lived in Great Neck between 1926 and 1931. And the houses of Groucho and Chico and their parents are still extant, still here. Heck, and you can find those. I delivered the names of the street in my talk. I don't know if you have enough clues to find it. If you're really intrepid, you can find out where they live. Also, I'd be remiss if I didn't recommend this book, The Marx Brothers Miscellany, which I wrote, and which is why I'm speaking here. I'm a great necker, love the town, and like the Marx madness. So I hope you enjoy it.
Welcome to Great Neck House. Nice for all of you to be here tonight for our first program of this season as we start up after having hope everybody had an enjoyable summer. Before we get started and before I introduce the speaker, I want to make special thanks to the Park District for Great Neck House, to Rob Campbell, to the whole staff. They're always so helpful in setting things up and making it comfortable for everyone and dealing with all the technical aspects that I don't have to do. I'm so happy about that because we'd be in the dark and we wouldn't be recording this tonight. I also want to thank Great North Shore TV, it's now called. I'm so used to calling it public access, but the great people over at North Shore who send us such wonderful cameramen and women to take these programs so that they can become a part of our archives, and they will be available on YouTube. So if you've missed something or you want to tell a friend or neighbor about the program and would like to share it with them, you can. It'll be there. Andre Vinterpool is our cameraman tonight. So I'm very, very happy about our program tonight. Actually, Trav did a program for us back in 2019 about the stars of Great Neck. Many, many famous people who lived here who were involved with the arts. And he did a lot of research on that. I mean, he knew a lot of the top tier of the famous that we all know. But he really dug deep into that and spent a lot of time on that program, and it was wonderful. So he volunteered to share with us his latest passion. I guess he's been going with this for quite a long time, Travis Stewart, but better known as Trav SD, who has written books about entertainers. He has one out that is terrific. It's No Applause, Just Throw Money, the book that made vaudeville famous. So one of his many publications. He's gotten involved in so many programs around the metro area involved with the arts, and he will tell you more about his involvement with the Marx brothers. I have one short story to tell. When I was at the newspaper and the Historical Society under Joan Wheeler, who unfortunately no longer lives here, but she's very much involved with everything we do, was in charge of our plaque program that recognizes historic sites for various reasons. And the house that Groucho Marx lived in received one of those plaques. And I was fortunate enough to interview the lady, Mrs. Bruell, who had moved there with her husband and raised children there, and absolutely was so thrilled to be in that house. And she told me that her only disappointment was that one day when she was out of town, Groucho showed up with an entourage and wanted to see the house and what they had done with it. And luckily her father was there, and he very proudly showed Groucho around, and all the rooms of in the house of the kids, there were posters from the movies, so he could certainly tell that the family really had a special feeling for this home that had meant so much to him. So I felt very honored to have seen that beautiful house, and so that's my story about the Marx Brothers. And now, I would like to bring Travis up and welcome him. And thank you so much. Please don't be like that.
And a good part of this talk is kind of like maybe an appendix to Carol's trip to Groucho's house. I'm going to take you there, and you get to see that plaque. So thank you, Carol, and Great Neck House, and Great Neck Historical Society, and North Shore Television. Okay. I'm a firm believer in public access. And I want to thank my lovely wife, who is the great necker of our couple. I'm not from here, but I've lived here since about 2018, thanks to her, and she helps me with my talks as everything else. I've been a Marx Brothers aficionado for maybe 50 years, since I was a child. I'm not a local historian per se. I'm more of a showbiz historian, like Carol said. I've written several books. I write a blog called Travelanche that's heavily trafficked and features biographies and showbiz stories dating back all the way to ancient Greece, all the way to the present, because that's my jam. People think that I know about these things. I'm not really a historian per se, although I worked at the New York Historical Society for about 8 years as their PR man. But I approach things more from the journalist point of view. I'm a critic. I wrote for the Village Voice. I wrote for American Theater. Had some pieces in the New York Times and the New York Sun. And so what I do is I get really interested about something, really curious, and have to bone up on it. So like a lot of people, I'm a Marx Brothers fan, but living here, made me very curious about the days when the Marx Brothers lived here and where they lived and what the social scene was like at the time and all of that. So many of the people that I had already written about and spoke about in that 2019 talk lived here mostly in the teens, in the 20s, and the 30s, kind of the heyday of the last century, of course. So I've just had a lot of fun kind of bumming around Great Neck and seeing where they live. Some quite obscure stars' houses are still extant, as it happens. To my regret, I have found that I need to build a little more explanation than I used to when I do a talk like this. I'm going to guess that everyone here is old enough to remember something about the Marx Brothers or to know something about the Marx Brothers. It may shock you to learn that people born after the advent of the internet and social media really have no reason to know anything that happened before they were born somehow. So when I speak to college kids, or like the kids who live next door to me, for example, good, smart kids, never heard of the Marx Brothers, ever. I hope you'll bear with me if you already know who they are, because, take it as a refresher course, maybe, a little reminder about what the various characters are like and stuff, but I found that it's kind of necessary to even explain who they are in the first place. All right. The Marx Brothers were 5 comical siblings whose careers lasted from the beginning to end, basically the first 3/4 of the 20th century. As a group, they're best known for about a dozen Hollywood films from the late 1920s to the early 1940s. The best known are the first several: The Coconuts, Animal Crackers, Monkey Business, Horse Feathers, Duck Soup, A Night at the Opera, and A Day at the Races. And then some people know their little comeback film from a little bit later called The Night in Casablanca. The core of the act was the three oldest brothers, and they're the only ones who are in all of the movies. This is Groucho, Julius Marx, better known as Groucho, whom many would name as the single most influential comedian of the 20th century. He was a very verbal comedian, so his influence extended mostly over stand-up comedians of the old school. Alan King used to live here. Alan King would be somebody who was influenced by Groucho. He was known for his wisecracks and his witticisms, and his fans ranged from major literary figures to just kids. He hosted the game show You Bet Your Life in the 1950s. And there are just plenty of comedians, including the biggest names of comedy, who still name him as an influence, an active influence. Although the oldest generation about whom that's kind of massively true, or majority true, would probably be baby boomers, people like Jerry Seinfeld and Billy Crystal and my close personal friend Robert Klein. He's not close, I'm just boasting. Younger comedians tend to be under the spell of improv and like SCTV and Second City, and they tend to name people like Richard Pryor or people like George Carlin as their influences, and tend not to go with Groucho. The improv philosophy kind of goes against the kind of verbal wordplay, like punning and malapropisms and so forth that the Marx Brothers did. But Groucho was still on TV, making live concerts and record albums well into my time, till he died, passed away in 1977. His face was so famous with the mustache and glasses and cigar that it became a famous joke shop disguise, which I bet the kids even know if they don't know who Groucho is. The second most famous is Harpo. He was a silent comedian, kind of the opposite of Groucho. His real name was Adolf. He changed it to Arthur for obvious reasons. The name Adolf went horribly out of fashion after about 1933, say. He was known for being a physical comedian. He made funny faces. He'd stand on his head. He had magical properties, pulled props out of his coat and out of his hat. And iconically, he played the harp. And he communicated by kind of squawking and honking this old-fashioned taxi horn. He was still a fixture on TV into the mid-60s when he passed away. To this day, he's also on a short list of major influences, usually of physical comedians and clowns, the clown community, small and beleaguered clown community. Clowns are fighting a defensive war in the show business these days. The third brother is actually the oldest brother, and was in many ways kind of the leader of the act, Chico, whose real name was Leonard. He was the oldest brother. He kind of managed them at a certain point. He's kind of a rough character, and a lot of people have a lot of affection for him because he was just kind of a genuine showbiz animal. And in addition to pretending to be an Italian, which is an old vaudeville shtick, he was a tremendous ragtime piano player, and he had this funny way of shooting the keys when he hit certain notes. He was also known for his irresponsibility, so even though he negotiated great deals for them, he squandered his own money. He was a gambler and a womanizer. He was still a public figure until he passed away in the early 60s. He had, for a while, after they never really broke up, but they kind of semi-retired and broke up. He had a big band that he fronted and toured around with in the 40s and 50s. And then, of course, poor Zeppo, the younger brother, whose real name was Herbert, kind of a lateral move there, Herbert Zeppo. He's in the first 5 movies with the brothers, and his role was kind of an awkward, neglected straight man. Offstage, he was said to be the funniest, believe it or not, and there are lots of anecdotes about how funny he was. Basically, he had 4 older, funny brothers to study from, and he could do all the stuff they did. In fact, on a couple of occasions, he he was an understudy for Groucho in live shows. But he was the youngest, and the others were very selfish, and they wouldn't give him a lot of stage time or screen time. So today he's remembered as kind of an affectionate joke. Zeppo is actually the fifth brother. He was drafted into the act to replace the fourth brother, Milton, or Gummo, who retired from show business in 1918. So I'm always delighted to talk about Gummo because he's more like the other three than Zeppo was, but he doesn't really figure in today's talk because he was out of the picture before they moved to Great Neck. I've sort of gone about this backwards, talking about the brothers separately in order to introduce them to you or to jog your memory. But now we're going to rewind to the beginning in order to get us on the train to Great Neck. The whole family. The Marxes, like their namesake Karl, were German Jews. Their parents were immigrants from opposite sides of Germany. Their mother, Minnie Schurenberg, was from Dornum, which is near the Netherlands. Their father, Sam, known as Frenchie, was from Alsace-Lorraine, which kind of gets batted back and forth between France and Germany historically, which country it belongs to. So there are Germans there, there are French people there. Most importantly, Minnie's parents were performers in the old country. The grandfather was a magician and a ventriloquist, and the grandmother played the harp. And Minnie and Sam met at a ballroom dancing class, which I believe he was teaching. So he was a slick dancer. He wasn't in show business, but he understood it. Minnie's brother was known as Al Sheen, and he became one of the top comedians in vaudeville with a team called Gallagher and Sheen. This is them. This is the sheet music to what was one of the most popular songs in vaudeville, Oh, Mr. Gallagher, Oh, Mr. Sheen, it's called. I'm going to go ahead and define vaudeville, because lately I'm finding even people older than I don't know what it was anymore. Basically, before cinema and before broadcast TV, certainly, but also before radio, there was a very sophisticated way to get entertainment around the country, and it had to do with our travel networks, transportation networks, and new communication networks. So basically, they built entire major chains of theaters that were in cities big and small. Some of them were fabulous palaces. Oh, by the way, don't turn off your cell phones. Take pictures of me and put them out on the internet. and put a hashtag Great Neck Historical Society. There's no need for you to turn off your phone. Don't take a call. But, so, you know, starting around 1870s, 1880s, the live theaters started presenting what's called variety entertainment, and you're still old enough to remember TV variety shows, which were basically the heir to the live version of vaudeville. Ed Sullivan's show was the most vaudevillian of the TV variety shows. But basically, like the name implies, it's all kinds of entertainment that you can possibly conceive of all in one show. Singers, dancers, comedians, like straight dramatic sketches, magicians, ventriloquists, acrobats, dog acts, ballerinas. Big theaters could, the largest theater had an elephant act, you know, all kinds of circus acts. So from the 1880s till about 1932, there was this network, and the performers would be booked on entire circuits, and then they would go around the country, usually by train, from place to place, and stay in flea-bag hotels. And so that's what vaudeville was, and that's how the Marx Brothers came up. And comedy teams, I probably don't need to explain that to this crowd, but younger people might not know. It's almost a dead concept, you know. Sadly, it dates back to minstrel shows. That's where the tradition of there being a straight man and a goofy partner dates to, but it was a major part of vaudeville. And, you know, you'll certainly know people like George Burns and Gracie Allen and Abbott and Costello and Laurel and Hardy. Those are your two-man comedy teams. There were three-man comedy teams like the Three Stooges or the Ritz Brothers or the Marx Brothers when Zeppo left. There were even four-man comedy teams. Lots of them back in the 1890s, but really the only modern one I can think of is the Marx Brothers. Although you can get a bit more modern and say that the Beatles in their movies or the Monkees are like four-man comedy teams. So, here's them when they're really young in the act and their characters haven't yet quite gelled. Uncle Al was a vaudeville star, and the brothers were all talented, so when they were quite young, they put together this act with Minnie, their mother, as their manager. They started out as a singing act, but then they evolved into this crazy, wild, anarchistic, surreal comedy act combining Groucho's verbal wit, Harpo's physical comedy and harp playing, Chico's dialect humor and ragtime piano playing, with Gummo and then Zeppo playing the straight man. Little digressive bit of trivia, Cary Grant was a big fan of Zeppo's, believe it or not. He studied Zeppo's moves as a straight man. Because in show business, very often you'll see performers doing things off the cuff. For example, you're watching Johnny Carson or Bob Hope. Very teeny tiny, infinitesimal things that they'll do are intentional. And they're almost like a magician's sleight of hand. They've worked out that timing so carefully. It's kind of a dead art to do it that way, but back in the day it was like that. So anyway, these brothers struggled in vaudeville for years, as one did back then, living on the road in cheap hotels, cheap restaurants, being bitten by fleas, eating crappy food, crisscrossing the country on these long train rides, back when the seats were all wooden, enduring the occasional hostility from locals, completely transient life with few comforts. Prior to moving to Great Neck, the family had lived in around a dozen different locations, mostly in Yorkville, in Manhattan. It was a predominantly German neighborhood then, when they were growing up. For about a decade, when they were grown, they lived in Chicago, believe it or not, and at a certain point, they actually invested in a farm and tried farming. I guess they thought they would save on eggs and things like that. They actually gave that a go. And then, like all immigrant stock, they were aspirational. They wanted to own something for themselves. So they moved back to New York around 1920, and by then they're starting to get married, and the brothers lived in separate New York apartments. And the parents lived in Richmond Hill, Queens, which we're just gonna breeze by. That's their place, it's still extant. So they're starting to creep out this way, heading east. And then everything changed with this. Just about a century ago, the Marx Brothers hit it big. That's why I'm wearing this shirt. It's kind of why I'm here today. They had this review, their first book show, or their first Broadway review. It was called I'll Say She Is. And to observe the momentous anniversary, we had a major Marx Brothers festival earlier this year to celebrate. A guy named Noah Diamond recreated the show. He did a lot of sort of archaeological research, if you will, because there's no script of the show anywhere. And he put the pieces together, and we made a show of it and presented the first ever revival of I'll Say She Is. And he also designed this, very talented guy. He also plays Groucho. I'll Say She Is was basically when the Marx Brothers began to be famous. I mean, people knew them, they were notorious in vaudeville and stuff. You know, show business people knew them. But they started to really get famous in about 1924 when they brought I'll Say She Is to Broadway. It brought them their first financial security. and it put them into contact with elevated new associates in the theatrical and literary communities, many of whom were living in Great Neck and the surrounding area. F. Scott Fitzgerald didn't invent the term the Jazz Age, but he's associated with it. This is his 1922 collection of short stories, Tales of the Jazz Age. More importantly, he was living in Great Neck, as I'm sure most of you know, when he wrote most of The Great Gatsby, which is inspired by the local scene here. That book turns 100 years old next year, so I hope you're going to hear a lot more about it over the next few months. The first theatrical adaptation of that book was produced at the late and much missed Great Neck Playhouse, which used to be on Middle Neck Road. It sat 1,500 people. So Fitzgerald still lived, his house is still extant, and it's in Great Neck Estates. He lived there from 1922 to 1924. As many of you know, I'm sure, the great sports writer and humorist Green Lardner lived on East Shore Road, and more to the point, the great journalist and editor Herbert Bayard Swope lived right near him on East Shore Road, starting in 1919. He rented a house there. Then about 10 years later, oh, thank you. I thanked her preemptively at the beginning of the talk. Thanks. Yeah, so he moved to Sands Point in 1928, but that was still part of the same larger social scene. All those wild Prohibition-era parties, you could just smuggle the booze in right off the water. Most significantly, among the people who attended those parties were literary figures like the great theater critic Alexander Woollcott and Dorothy Parker, two of the most famous members of the so-called Algonquin Round Table. Do y'all know what the... Okay, didn't know. All right, we'll leave the remedial stuff behind. This great Hirschfeld picture. I know who most of these are. Woolcott's the chubby one with the glasses. There's Dorothy Parker, Robert Sherwood. Robert Benchley is the one with the sleepy eyes. The one with glasses and the crazy hair with his back to us is George S. Kaufman, the playwright. They'll all figure into this story. Anyway, Woolcott was basically the guy who put the Marx Brothers on the map. He wrote a rave review of I'll Say She Is in the New York World, and it became a hit. He was especially ecstatic about Harpo, and so Harpo became a kind of adjunct member of the Algonquin Round Table, which is kind of counterintuitive because Groucho was the literary one. He was the verbal one. Harpo rarely spoke, never mind uttered witticisms, which is what the Algonquin gang were known for. He just liked to sit back and have a good time, have a few drinks or whatever, but they liked him. Groucho wasn't quite as social. I'm sure he preferred to be the only wit in the room. And anyway, Harpo went to all of those great, wild, Great Neck parties at Swope's house, and his other brothers did too. Lots of other showbiz people either bought or rented houses out here as well. George M. Cohan and his producing partner Sam Harris in the area around what's now Stepping Stone Park. The great vaudeville comedian Ed Wynn built a massive estate called Wingate, not far away. Silent movie star Thomas Megan lived next door to Wynn, and as a side note, Megan got heavily involved in the Florida real estate market, investing in an area called Newport Richey, which he was calling the Great Neck of the South, and promoting it that way prior to the big boom, to the bust, the Florida boom. So that whole episode, the Florida land boom and bust, was the inspiration, of course, for their first book, the Marx Brothers' first book show, The Coconuts, depicted here. You can see the palm trees, fake palm trees in the back. And while we're talking about inspiration, the Marx Brothers' next vehicle, Animal Crackers, written by George S. Kaufman and Maury Ruskin, who also wrote The Coconuts, was directly inspired by the Gold Coast social scene we're talking about. Do y'all know Animal Crackers? Groucho said that Roscoe W. Chandler was kind of based on the arts patron Otto Kahn, who lived out here. He died, built Oheka Castle in Cold Spring Harbor around the same time. So I was tempted to show a lot of pictures of the following people and their mansions, but it's a digression. So I'm going to stick to this Animal Crackers picture as being representative of the zeitgeist. Like I found a great picture of a party of of Scott and Zelda believe me, it's kind of hard to find pictures of parties because people don't want their pictures taken at a wild party, especially back then. And also, the photography wasn't so good back then, and they're drinking illegal liquor. It's kind of hard to find pictures of people actually partying at a party in the 20s. Anyway, some other local characters who lived here include Eddie Cantor, built a huge mansion and farm near Lake Success. W.C. Fields lived in Russell Gardens for a couple of seasons. Lou Fields, the team of Weber and Fields, huge influence on Gallagher and Sheen and on Groucho, lived here. Other Broadway stars like Fanny Brice and Marilyn Miller and Raymond Hitchcock and Robert Woolsey of Wheeler and Woolsey, P.G. Wodehouse and Guy Bolton lived very near to Great Neck House on Arundel in different houses. Oscar Shaw, who appeared with the Marx Brothers in The Coconuts, lived here, as did Maurice Chevalier briefly, who we all know gets a big send-up in Monkey Business. At any rate, you can see why the Marx Brothers would want to move here then, both because they come from those humble beginnings, but also because it was pretty fabulous, and their friends lived here. So the window during which they lived here was pretty brief, and this was true of most of these stars. They came during the boom time, the Roaring 20s. Broadway was flourishing, that was where they worked. But when they started making movies, they were also working, at the same time, they're working at Paramount's studio in Astoria, Queens. So this is also very handy to that, to commuting to that. But two major things happened to kill the theatrical colony here. One was the Great Depression, of course. Eddie Cantor no sooner built his palace when he lost everything in the stock market and had to sell it. Groucho lost everything in the stock market. The other major factor was the coming of talkies. With Broadway suffering because of the Depression anyway, all the actors and writers moved out to Hollywood. But if you can imagine Beverly Hills before it was transplanted out there, that's kind of what Great Neck was like in the teens and 20s, late teens and 20s. So the timeline goes like this of their career. After I'll Say She Is, they went into their next Broadway show, The Coconuts, which ran from 1925 through 1927. That was followed by their next Broadway show, Animal Crackers, which ran 1928 through 29. During that run, they were simultaneously shooting the movie The Coconuts by day and then performing on stage in Animal Crackers at night. Very exhausting, I would imagine. They didn't do, then in 1930 they shot Animal Crackers in Astoria, but didn't do a Broadway show. I'm guessing either because that was too exhausting to do both at the same time, or also because Broadway was really suffering after the stock market crash, and there was not a lot of activity on Broadway starting in 1930, through most of the 30s, believe it or not. That was the very period when burlesque houses started to fill the empty Broadway houses. The always aspirational Groucho moved here first, but we're going to talk about him last because there's much more to tell, mostly because it was well chronicled by his son, Arthur, who was a prolific author and playwright and screenwriter. As for the rest of the family, The parents, Frenchie and Minnie, lived on Jason Avenue. I can say the streets, right? I won't say the numbers. Not that you're all gonna, let's go over there, let's cause a commotion. Jason Avenue and not Freddy versus Jason is what you get when you mix Friday the 13th with Nightmare on Elm Street. So anyway, Frenchie and Minnie moved out here to be closer to their married sons, Chico and Groucho, and their families. Naturally, the sons were supporting the parents by this point. The area and the house were not as Tony as their own places, just solid, pleasant, tree-lined, middle-class street, not a Gold Coast mansion. The one anecdote I've heard about life there, I think there's another picture too. When the brothers would show up for like regular family dinners with their parents, all the neighborhood kids would gather around and gawk, so the brothers would show off and fool around for them. What I love about that story is it's almost like an exact replay of what would happen when they were kids back in the neighborhood, and Uncle Al Sheen would come back, you know, with fancy pinky ring and throwing coins into the air, and all the kids. I mean, when you see movies with kids running around Harpo, they kind of stage it in the movie so that just the children love Harpo, but in reality they would come around, the whole family. Speaking of which, this was taken outside the Richmond Hill house. I haven't found any outside the Jason Ave house. But what I like about it is it kind of speaks to that atmosphere I was just talking about, like right outside the house. That's Groucho's wife, Ruth, on the left, Frenchie, Chico's daughter, Maxine, with Harpo holding her, Groucho, and then Groucho's son, Arthur, who's not yet in long pants. One thing to note about that is there's no Chico. That will be a recurring theme. And then Minnie is not there either, and that's more foreshadowing of a sadder kind. Sadly, their mother was to live in Great Neck for only a few months. Shortly after they moved here, she died of a stroke. The parents were coming back from a big family dinner at Zeppo's apartment. He had a swinging bachelor pad in New York. And then she kind of slumped over in the car on the way home, coming across the Queensboro Bridge. And they turned the car around, went back to Zeppo's place, where she passed away. The father went with the sons out to Hollywood, and he died 4 years later. Chico's place, still extant as well. This is on Myrtle Drive in Great Neck Estates. So Chico was the oldest and also naturally the first to start a family. He'd been married for about a dozen years when he moved out here in 1929. He just had the one kid, Maxine, who was about 11. In later years, she wrote the only biography of Chico that exists, and it is probably likely ever to exist. And it's not very illuminating about the time in Great Neck. They were only here for a couple of years, and accounts of the home life were mostly about how she was stifled by her mom. It was mostly the two of them in that house because Chico was either off doing a show or partying afterwards, or otherwise philandering or gambling. Almost by definition, Chico wasn't home much. So there's no pictures of them there, so there's just me in a Chico-like hat. This is Harpo, out of costume, looking very dashing. Harpo was a lot like Chico temperamentally, but he was sensible enough and kind enough not to get married. And I think Chico probably got married for the old-fashioned reason, you know what I mean. Harpo didn't get married until 1936 when he was almost 50 years old, and then he settled down big time. But before that, he lived a lot like Zeppo, who was much younger, by, like in swinging bachelor pads or couch surfing. In 1930, he came out to Great Neck and rented this house. And if you Google this item from the Great Neck record from 1930, you'll find like 10 references to it online. It's kind of a silly puff piece of the kind they used to do back in the day, especially in Hollywood. Basically, it makes it sound like Harpo, the man, is just like Harpo, the comedian. So the article, the reportage is about him running around chasing chorus girls and honking his horn and stuff at this place. It's really not illuminating. I wish it had the address. We know it was the home of Henry Holthusen, or Major Henry Holthusen. He'd been in World War I. This guy was he was a diplomat and a corporate lawyer. He worked in the Hoover administration. We know these things about him because he was kind of a public figure. But I looked in the Great Neck phone book in 1929, 1930. He's not in there. I get the feeling that he was a short-term resident here too. He wasn't like a good time Charlie kind of guy. He was a very serious Republican kind of guy. He wasn't partying, taking part in the social scene. So anyway, the story doesn't tell us a lot about Harpo's time in Great Neck, but fortunately, Harpo wrote about it in his autobiography. So there's a little bit of flavor there. This is like probably the first time he was like in a house by himself, and he wrote about spending time with his dog, lying on the lawn with his shoes and socks off, and taking naps, and he rigged a special kite so that the ribbon would tickle his toes, so he claims. Before the summer was over, however, he was only here for a few weeks before the summer was over, Woolcock invited him to come to his summer place in Vermont, and he took him up on it and left town. Which brings us to Groucho. As we say, we moved here earlier than the others, yet he waited longer than he might have. He moved here in 1926, which was midway through the Broadway run of Animal Crackers. Recall that he had first started making big dough with the success of I'll Say She Is a couple of years earlier. But I perfectly understand his waiting. It all comes back to the fact, or why he was named Groucho. He wasn't particularly grumpy, after all. That's not his character. He's not like Grumpy in the Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. He makes wisecracks, but it's not really about him being ill-tempered. The origin of Harpo's name, we know he plays the harp. Chico's name, you learn once and you never forget. It was because he liked chicks. Less obvious, but you hear it and then you remember. Gummo's name was because he was the dancer in the act. He took after Frenchie, and he wore these gum-soled dancing shoes. But why Groucho? He was known for clinging tightly to his grouch bag, which was a little pouch with a drawstring that show folk used to store their money and valuables in. And a lot of actors traveled with those because if you left your valuables, say like in a locker or someplace off stage when you went on stage, it was liable, or if you left it in your hotel room, it was liable to get stolen. And Groucho's had his money stolen more than once, been stranded as far away as Colorado when he was just like a kid working the circuits alone. So Groucho clung to his grouch bag. It was never without it. It's always under his shirt. He wasn't tight-fisted in terms of spending, but he didn't like to waste money. He liked it to be justified. So he was very vigilant. And also in show business, another reason for waiting to commit to a mortgage is you're in show business. You don't know where your next dollar is coming from. Your dollar comes from these temporary jobs. So he waited until he felt stable. And as a matter of fact, he waited until he had the entire sum for the house saved up, $27,000 back then. And he paid for it in cash, in one lump sum. So he was irrationally happy about that, to be a homeowner. No one's ever been more thrilled to live in the suburbs than Groucho. Completely exotic to him. That's not his house, but that's the neighborhood. We'll get to his house. So the house was and still is on Lincoln Road in what is now Thomaston. It was known originally, this development was known as Great Neck Villa. Thomaston wasn't incorporated until shortly after Groucho left the area. That's an important detail because as lifelong city dwellers, I'm sure the Marx brothers thought everything was the country. So when they refer to Great Neck that way, which they often do, they call it the country. We're apt to take it with a grain of salt, but at this time the area was still semi-rural. Arthur, who was just a boy at the time, wrote of hundreds of acres of woods nearby with streams, ponds, rabbits, owls, snakes, ponds, very exotic to a city kid. Then, as now, really, there were just a couple of small villages at either end of Middle Neck Road with a handful of stores, you know, maybe produce market, bakery, butcher shop. They didn't yet have supermarkets back then. Groucho's stockbroker had a branch office here, which ended up being very important in those days before, during, and after the crash. There is an anecdote about him trying to join the Sands Point Beach Club. He's a famous non-joiner of clubs, you know that one-liner. He went to the Sand Points and showed up with Arthur to join, and they said they didn't admit Jews. So he said, my son's only going to go in the water up to his knees. Can we? He's half Jewish. He's only going to go up to his knees. And he ended up spending $5,000, which is, you know, a good chunk of what he paid for his house, to join the Lakeville Country Club, which no longer exists, but was kind of near where the parents lived. I was startled to see that there are 7 golf courses near here. Which just only goes to show it's not my game, because I would have known long before that. Would you like to see Groucho's car? Sure. Yeah, sure. No, that's not Groucho's car. So this is the Packard he bought in 1930, halfway through his time in Great Neck. Prior to that, he had a Lincoln car that was almost as impressive. This is the only photo I know of him outside his Great Neck house. And this is how he would get into the city to and fro for his performances at the theater. He'd drive there himself sometimes, but sometimes there were chauffeurs, but he would end up firing them. He was the kind of guy who was like a backseat driver, but also a terrible driver. So, you know, there's a really hair-raising story that's told by Arthur of they were coming back from the hospital when his little sister was born, bringing the baby back from the hospital, and the car stalled on the tracks. This is before the bridge that goes over the tracks. There was a grade, and the car got stuck, and the mom and the children left the car. Groucho was still trying to get it going as the train came. Unfortunately, the train stopped in time. But I did want to show this wonderful plaque that's on our bridge that goes over that explains about that. There were deaths and injuries because of the train crossing on the same grade as the road back then. So a lot of what I'm giving you comes from a book called My Life with Groucho, which was written by Arthur Marx. And fortunately, there's like an anecdote for each of my photos here, so it worked out well. This is the outside of the house. Basically, about a year ago, you probably saw in the papers that Groucho's old house was up for sale. And I heard that there was going to be an estate sale. I don't usually have this kind of chutzpah, but I thought this would be my only chance to ever do this, so I went over and went to the estate sale and rummaged around and took a lot of photos inside the house. So Groucho was extremely enthusiastic about being a homeowner, kind of surprisingly into it. It was a novelty for him. So like when the rain washed the gravel out of his driveway, he would very cheerfully get the wheelbarrow out and a shovel and go shovel the gravel back into the wheelbarrow, spread it back onto the driveway himself. He planted a whole orchard full of fruit trees. He cut down some of the shade trees for light. Oh, actually, here's the lovely plaque that the Great Neck Historical Society put together. And it's a lousy, uncentered photo because I was trying to do this surreptitiously. Anyway, here's the yard, which I loved. I thought it was a great place for kids. And so this is where Groucho planted his orchard of fruit trees. And he cut down a bunch of the shade trees. He really hated the dark. If you think about it, someone who's in show business is constantly backstage in the dark. They stayed in a lot of dingy hotel rooms, so he liked things to be bright and cheerful. So he cut down trees and then enlisted his son to help him cut logs for the fire. The boy was only 10 or something, towards the end. Eventually he got a gardener. He probably got over his exciting new hobby at a certain point. Hired a gardener. And we go in. This is the terrace out back. Another view. Yeah, and we should also point out, probably been several owners since Groucho left in 1931. So the furniture certainly, and probably most of the decor are not going to be the same. But I think you'll get like a feeling for the atmosphere in the rooms that'll match the stories. It's easy to picture them happening here. This is the age of bathtub gin. So this is where they'd hang out and drink and talk when he had guests over. There's one very good anecdote about this room. He was friends with Ring Lardner, and Ring used to come and hang out, and Groucho liked to go to bed early, but Lardner liked to stay up until like 4 o'clock in the morning. And Groucho got tired of that happening, so finally Groucho started with Lardner, but it ended up being a lifelong habit of just going to bed when he felt like it and saying, have a good time, everyone, and goes up to bed. And they can stay and they can drink the booze, but he's going to bed. So he did that to Lardner the first time he did it. When Groucho came down to breakfast in the morning, Ring Lardner was still sitting there up, sort of like hang out, and Ring Lardner said, I thought you were going to bed. This is the kind of like relationship they had. He'd been one-upped. This is the dining room, and when I went in there, I instantly pictured repartee, and then what I found in some of these anecdotes kind of bears it out. Like a lot of decent people from humble beginnings, Groucho hated table service. He was very uncomfortable with having somebody wait on him as a servant, But there was a lot of social pressure in Great Neck, which the wife mostly felt, his wife Ruth mostly felt. So he kind of caved in, and they did get servants. Throughout Groucho's life, apart from personal assistants, really the only kind of staff position he was comfortable having as part of his household was a cook. He cared about that a lot. Probably because he didn't intend to do that, couldn't do it, but also maybe there was a little pressure because his dad was famously a really good cook. So there's a story about the first dinner party when they first moved there. And you have to remember, like, these names, these big names we're dropping are like new friends. He only recently reached the status of knowing these people and being their friends. So at their first dinner party, the guests are George S. Kaufman and his wife, Beatrice, theater producer Sam Harris and his wife, producer Max Gordon and his wife, movie producer Bobby North and his wife, a wealthy manufacturer who just happened to live across the street who they wanted to impress. And then at the very last minute, other people, this used to happen all the time, I guess, a whole bunch of other people joined in and we got invited by friends, invited other friends. Maury Riskin and his wife came, that was George S. Kaufman's writing partner, Maury Riskin. Songwriter Harry Ruby and his wife. And so Groucho's wife, Ruth, was very, very agitated about all of this pressure. And she'd gone to all of these lengths to decorate the table and, you know, candles and flowers and decorate the room and, you know, and then they have to put out the card table to accommodate the other guests. And so it turned into this tizzy. The serving girl was drunk apparently and fell down. Roast beef wasn't done and they had to put it back in the oven. And then Groucho complained about the service, insisted, because the service was slow. He hated waiting for people to bring in courses, you know. So they're all getting drunk on illegal liquor. And so he asked the serving people to take bigger loads, like a tray with tons of stuff on it. And so then he bumped into somebody carrying a bunch of coffee cups and they wound up on the floor. So not just repartee, but also slapstick in that room. Oh gosh, okay. There is a funny story in Groucho Marx and Other Short Stories and Tall Tales called My Poor Wife. If we were running short, I was going to read this story, but I'm just going to recommend it to you. And many of the sort of bold-faced names I mentioned to you wind up in this story. Groucho, especially early at this part in his career, he wasn't just an actor, wasn't just a comedian, he was also a humorist. He admired all of those writers, and for a while, he wrote lots of short stories that were published in the New Yorker and various columns and newspapers. And he also wrote, before we get to that, this, I don't know, I like to think that this interesting door thing, this is a pantry between the dining room and the kitchen. And I like to picture him like having his like midnight snacks after coming back from a show in there or something like that. But I just love this door feature because I can picture kids playing hide and seek there or even Harpo doing that. You know, it's just like a fun thing to fool around with. Okay. This is the bedroom, and I wrote myself into this just because I was so moved and awed to be there, you know. Certainly that's not his bed, but it's where he was sleeping at the time he wrote his famous humor book, Beds. Yeah, he wrote 1930, when he was living here, he wrote a book. Didn't do so well back then, but it was re-released in the 70s and did very well. Groucho was an insomniac, by the way. So they didn't often entertain because Groucho had performances in the evening, and when they had people over, it was usually on a Sunday evening. The rest of the time, Ruth was in this big house alone with the kids in what was then the country. So Groucho got her a gun. And the baby found it and was spotted playing with it. So they put it in the safe. But that's another scary story. And it's kind of easy to sort of picture happening in this locale. So very similar to Chico's wife, being stuck alone in this massive house, far from the action. But Groucho was a homebody. That's the difference. When Groucho could get home, he was there and he was really into it. Chico was a tomcat. Now, I don't know if this is the other bedroom from the other angle, and I don't know if it's configured the way it was back then, but you see the bookshelves between the windows. Groucho was so excited to have space to build a library If you only live in apartments, like, you know, as a New York City dweller, or if you're always on the road in hotel rooms, you know, it's an impossibility. So this was the first time in his life he could build up his library, and this is the time when he was discovering authors like Tolstoy and Somerset Maugham, J.B. Priestley, H.G. Wells. W.C. Fields used to travel with a trunk full of his books, believe it or not, when he went on tour, an entire steamer trunk. This is sort of the third room attic. It's a kid's room now, and I picture it being one back then. Arthur wrote that Groucho read to him stuff like Winnie the Pooh and Swiss Family Robinson, and that was back when you had to ignore the fact that Daddy reeked of cigars. Here's your tour guide again. So in 1931, Paramount decided that they're going to rent out their Astoria studio and produce all of their movies in Hollywood. And the Marx Brothers and their dad all moved to Beverly Hills to make Monkey Business. You can see the dad, Frenchie, in a cameo in that movie as they're getting off the ship. On YouTube, there's a home movie that Groucho made with his family at their new Beverly Hills home in 1933. I wish there was a movie of them in Great Neck. There's some footage of W.C. Fields in Great Neck, but there's none of Groucho's family. It's pretty easy to transpose the images of them horsing around in that Beverly Hills home movie and just kind of pretend that it's Great Neck. You'll get a flavor for what the home life was like. Same people, same behaviors. So that's some homework for you, should you choose to accept it. And I have more homework for you. Two of my friends are having two separate related events at exactly the same time this weekend. But they're, by related, I mean related to this. So it's up to you which one you want to choose, if any. They're both this Sunday at 1 p.m. and they're both hosted by two of my fellow committee members at Marx Fest. Choice A. Noah Diamond and Henry Saposnik and Danny Fingerell, who's with us tonight. Where's Danny?
It's postponed.
Oh, it's postponed?
Yes.
Oh, then you can do both.
Yes, it's probably going to be October 13th.
Oh, okay. Well, that sounds like a very unlucky date, Danny. But anyway, they have a program that they produced in Marx Fest, and they're going to do it again. Did Someone Call Me Schnorrer, the Marx Brothers, and Jewish Identity? And it's through the Jewish Study Center online. So Danny's the man who brought Gabe Kaplan to Marx Fest for us. He won't let you down, will you, Danny? Good. All right. Well, I'll be watching that. Okay. So and then the sooner this Sunday at 1, Kevin Fitzpatrick, who's the head of the Dorothy Parker Society and president of the Lambs Club, where we had this, is giving his Great Gatsby boat tour of Manhasset Bay, departs from Port Washington, and there are still some seats on here. I took this tour a couple of months ago. It was very enjoyable. You get to gawk at all the mansions from the harbor. That one's not free, but Kevin has implemented a 10% discount code for you. The code, for some reason I don't understand, is GN Library. Great Neck House used to be the library, so I guess it's good enough for him. So just Google Great Gatsby Boat Tour and you'll find it. So I was going to see my plan, Danny, was to go on the boat tour and then look at my phone and watch his program between the houses.
I'm sorry to have ruined the plan.
Last homework, you can buy my book, the Marx Brothers Miscellany, published by Bear Manor Media. I have copies. Happy to sell them and sign them for you after we're done. I think we're done now. Thank you all for coming.
So I'm wondering if anyone has any questions.
Oh, yes. I forget about the all-important Q&A. I did, say what? Oh, is it? No, it's still on. If anyone has questions, again, I know lots about the Marx Brothers art and life, less about the Great Neck aspect, but willing to answer any may or may not have. That's may not.
Well, that just goes to show how
Oh,
thoroughly
that's
you
what
covered.
it.
Oh, wait, there's.
Yeah, just a comment, a great presentation. And I don't think a lot of people realize this, but in the last few years of his life, Groucho was out on the road doing concerts, usually at colleges or wherever anyone would book him. He had an accompanist with him.
Marvin Hamlin.
Yeah, Marvin Hamlin, of all people.
For part of it, it was his old songwriting partner. I think it was either Harry Ruby or Bert Kalmrack. I can't remember which.
I think it was Harry Ruby.
It was Harry
Elmer
Ruby.
was that, but-
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, and then Marvin Hamlin. Is it?
Which one of the Marx Brothers lived in Kensington? I just happened to live there, curious where they lived.
I think that's Chico-ish. I think it's it says New York Estates, but yeah, I had read that it was Kensington, but it's Myrtle Ave. It seems to be great Neck Estates. Yeah, yeah.
I'm not sure if you might know about this already, but I have a memory in the early to mid 70s. It might have been in the lead up to the bicentennial because the school system did a ton of events, often involving celebrities of some sort at that time. But Maxine Marx came to Great Neck to give a talk, I think at the school. I remember it being in the there being pictures in the paper. They had one of the students, it might have been Seth Zimmerman, who was a year or two older than me, got dressed up as Harpo Marx or whatever, and came out on stage with her or something. But I remember it being in the local papers and probably the Guidepost at the time, the Great Neck North. I don't know the exact year, but it was sometime in the early to mid 70s.
Do you have a question or?
No, I was just
okay.
mentioning.
Oh, yeah, no, that's
Marx
really cool.
Brothers'
Maxine
Great
Marx
Neck
was
connection in the 70s, but yeah.
was an amazing. Other than Arthur, she might be she was the oldest of the next generation of Marxists, and she was a wonderful character. She inherited Minnie's and Chico's skills as a manager. She was a talent agent for a lot of years, and she sounds like she was the kind of showbiz character you can imagine. She was kind of husky voiced and no nonsense, lots of profanity, that kind of a person. But she grew up, she spent a few of her childhood years here. Yeah, Danny.
Do you know, or maybe somebody in the room knows, what was the architectural style of Groucho's house? It's very distinctive.
I think of it as mock Tudor. I think everything around here is mock Tudor. With the stucco and the slate roofs and the. I believe that's what it's called. Yes.
You said you did another talk in 2019. Would that be on YouTube?
It was taped by the folks from the station.
Was taped
Yeah, I
by
thought
the
so. Maybe it didn't come out, but I remember the cameraman being here.
Then it may not have been uploaded to YouTube then, but we certainly, I'm sure, could arrange that.
It was a good talk. I was there.
Oh, thank you.
I
Thanks.
would love to.
Yeah, if you I don't know if you'll remember this. My email is travesty@gmail. And if you write to me, I can send you a text of this
I
picture.
would love that.
Yes, sir.
Speaking of that 2019 engagement, at the end of it, there was some questions, and one of the questions came up was, did Fanny Bryce ever live in Great Neck? And you basically said that, as far as you knew at that time, she didn't, but Nicky lived with his second wife.
Thank you for reminding me.
With his
Yeah, that
brother-
was 5 years ago.
With
Yeah.
his brother
That's
and
right.
sister-in-law.
This talk, it's
Yeah, you mentioned Fanny lived
yeah,
there.
yeah. For this talk, that was bad journalism. Last time, I looked into every single person I talked about and didn't just sort of borrow from existing lists. And I think I did learn that, right? He was here with another wife, so. Though the lore is that Fanny Bryce lived here, apparently she did.
Yeah, Nikki, the law was, because Nikki lived here, everyone is a fan, but it was after the divorce.
And it just sounds perfect, right? Marx Brothers, Eddie Cantor, Fanny Bryce.
Yeah.
Why not?
Yeah. Anything else?
I think the other, and I don't think she has anything to do with Great Neck, but I believe it's Chico's wife, Barbara?
No.
Betty was his first.
No, Barbara.
Barbara's wife is Barbara.
Oh,
Barbara's
Zeppo's,
Marco's wife is Susan Fleming.
yeah, Zeppo was married to Barbara, who was married to Frank Sinatra.
Okay, yeah, that's what I was gonna say, you know, she just, I think within the last 10 years she passed away.
Yeah, pretty much.
Because the Marx Brothers, that particular Marx brother liked them young.
So did Ben.
Yeah, I think Gummo was the biggest square in the family. Home buddy. Good, well, thank you so much, and thank you for this wonderful turnout.
Thank you so much. I would also like to, before you leave, I'd like to recognize our president at the back, Jay Mankus.
Thank you, and anyone who cares to join the society, we're happy to have you. Just go on the website, Greatness Historical.
And it's been our pleasure to have you here tonight. I'm so glad all of you came. I hope you really, I'm sure you enjoyed it. I know that I did. And I can't tell you what our next program exactly is going to be or when. However, we do have some great ideas, and we have great ideas for programs. The hard part is finding a speaker who is very knowledgeable and comfortable speaking. So we have zillions of ideas, but we are working on some things that I think are going to be very interesting, and we will be in touch.